all heard the day-old debate on whether or not one should get a Bugatti Veyron or a super high-powered tuner car like a Supra. Now, why is this even a debate? Well, this is because they both make the same power, however, one costs 20 times more than the other. Non-car people see the Bugatti's price and automatically believe that it is way too expensive for just a car. But a true enthusiast knows it's not only about horsepower figures. You're comparing a 90s economy car to a car purpose-built for billionaires. Let's first compare the biggest talking point up for debate, power figures. A built 2JZ with a big single turbo can easily make 1200 horsepower plus, however you need to look at how it makes that power. A small displacement engine has to spin at high RPMs to spool a big turbo, making the power come in only at the top end. This means that under 4K RPM, the car will feel almost naturally aspirated and power won't be achieved until your exhaust gases are moving fast enough to get the turbo moving. Now let's look at the dyno chart for a Veyron. Its peak torque is being made early at 2K RPM. This engine is less elastic than 2JZ. The fact that it's almost always producing peak torque means that it's less stressed and its state doesn't change as much as a 2JZ. What many enthusiasts fail to understand is that there are levels to engineering. All people nowadays look at peak power numbers to judge how good a car is, and that's disingenuous. For example, as I said before, a fully built 2JZ makes peak power at almost 9,000 RPM, while a W16 makes peak power around 4,000 RPM, with peak torque happening much lower. This means that in a W16 the ride will be smoother and it will be easier to drive around town. Most people like to believe that they are some sort of race car driver and they need the most sport-oriented vehicle. However, actual owners of said cars can attest to the fact that they are pretty much undrivable on a day-to-day basis. From the super heavy clutch that makes noise and bucks every time you get going, to the power delivery sending you from 300 horsepower to 1000 horsepower and a couple thousand RPMs, these cars have one purpose, and that is straight line top speed. The same can be said about the Bugatti because it's heavy and is said to handle like a boat, but this is only specifically for the first generation of the Veyron. The Super Sport, the Grand Vitesse, they all were upgraded in terms of suspension and handling, and they actually handle a lot better. When you sit in a Bugatti Veyron, you'll realize that though it boasts 1000 horsepower and a 253 mph top speed, it is a very quiet, well-equipped luxury car. While on the other hand, in the Supra, you'll probably be sitting in a race seat with a harness and using all of your hands and feet to drive. In the Veyron, you can drive with complete ease. Not only is it automatic, well, a dual clutch, but the noise presents an aura of cigarette boat rather than race car. It never seems to be too stressed, no matter how hard it's being driven. Next, we have to compare the technology used to achieve that power. A 2JZ is a 3-liter straight 6 motor developed by Toyota in the 90s. The high-power Supras almost always use a single turbo setup. Stock that came with small twins. In the Bugatti, a newly developed W16 was designed by VW and it uses 4 turbochargers. As I mentioned, the main difference between these two cars is that one is operating at its mechanical limits and the other one has barely tapped in. One is built on a 30-year-old platform and the other one is designed and built to modern standards. These are a couple quick engine facts to differentiate between the W16 and the 2JZ. The W16, 8-liter. Bore and stroke has a square setup, 86mm by 86mm, aluminum block and heads, 4 valves per cylinder, 64 valves. It has 2 sets of dual overhead cams, meaning it has 4 cams total. 2 separate cooling systems, one for the engine and one for the forced induction. Max pressure for the quad turbos is 18 psi, and it is a heavy engine weighing at 882 pounds. I decided to compare it to a built 2JZ as opposed to a stock one because those are really only the ones I can compare to the Veyron in terms of power figures. For this example, I'm using the 1000 horsepower Pro Drift Supra. They stroked it to 3.4 liters from 3 liters. The bore and stroke is 86mm by 94mm. The bottom end of a 2JZ is actually iron, but it has aluminum heads. It also has 4 valves per cylinder, 24 valves total. This specific 2JZ build has non-VVT, makes it a little bit simpler, makes reliability a little bit better. It uses a twin scroll single turbo and uses 36 psi of boost. Notice that this engine is under a lot more stress than the W16. 36 psi boost is double the amount of pressure, which means that you're probably going to have at least half of the engine life. Another interesting thing is that the W16 gets 7 city and 15 highway, while a built 2JZ gets 10 city and 20 highway. Now, For the 2JZ, obviously the numbers are all over the place depending on how you drive, but it is interesting to see that the 2JZ just barely beats the W16 overall in terms of fuel economy. This just has to do with newer technology and the fact that the W16 runs pump gas while a built 2JZ is probably using E85. Obviously nobody in either of these markets cares about fuel economy, but it just goes to show how far technology has came between the two cars, and that is reflective on more than just the fuel economy. As I mentioned before, the Mark IV Supra is essentially an economy car. Leather seats weren't even standard, and that was pretty much the only option from the factory. The Veyron, on the other hand, is in another league of quality. Not only is every material fully customizable as well as color, but each car goes through vigorous testing before it's sold. A Veyron goes through testing in the French mountains as well as a 200-mile-per-hour run on a runway before it reaches its buyer. I use the Supra and the Veyron comparison as an analogy for what happens when you invest time and effort into something. Of course, a Supra is one of the JDM legends and will always remain as such, but when you have teenagers and their moms on the internet saying that they would rather have a Supra because the Veyron is a waste of money, they're out of their mind. What they don't understand is that almost a decade of work was put into secrecy to develop just the drivetrain because they had to do it from scratch. No other car uses this platform and probably will ever use this platform besides the Strung. What they don't understand is the thousands of hours put into each car from development to production to testing. Most car manufacturers simply roll the car off the assembly line and it goes straight to the dealer. When you hand build bespoke vehicles, you only want the best to do the job. This is why Bugatti engineers have to go through rigorous training to even have the opportunity to work on a car. It is one thing to design a high performance version of an engine like the 2JZ when you have tens of thousands of examples already in existence. But with the W16, it's basically designed from scratch and developed from scratch. You have no R&D team besides yourself. The technology found on the Veyron is no match for any vehicle even 15 years later, besides his younger brother, the Chiron. No vehicle has a pedigree of 16 cylinders, 4 turbochargers, 10 radiators, and a 200 mph top speed stock. The Veyron cost an average of $6 million to produce, and they were sold new for $1.6 million. Volkswagen took a huge loss simply because they wanted to push the boundaries. Hypercars built with the intention of being the best will always outshine tuner cars because of the work of pure intentions always supersedes that of afterthoughts. What people fail to understand is a fully built Supra, no matter how fast it is an afterthought. It's maxing out a platform that was never intended to be maxed out. This means the biggest issue and the leading difference between the two comparisons is that the W16 is going to actually be reliable while a built 2JZ will have constant problems. At the end of the day, it's unfair to compare the two because they aren't in the same class, price point, or century. But I had to make this point saying that the comparison is just dumb. Most people arguing this aren't even familiar with the concept of engineering and how hard it is to bring a mechanical idea into fruition, but that's with most things in life. People often stop reading after the headlines, and that's what we see here. All in all, people are going to have their opinions about what they spend their money on because people value money differently.